As far as I can remember, in the 37 years we've been together, my son Kirk and I have never had a major knockdown, drag-out fight. In fact, even on those days when we playfully wrestle with each other, it looks more like leaning. We may grab hold of each other with the intent to wrestle, but we tend to end up leaning on each other, sometimes for considerable time, most of the time laughing, until we decide we're done leaning, and then we go back to doing whatever it was we were doing before. That's kind of like about 90% of my relationship with God. A lot of leaning and holding on and then getting back to reality. But then there is that 10% of actual wrestling. And when that 10% happens, at least for me, it gets pretty intense. And God and I have had some knockdown, drag-out fights over the years. It was the time when my grandmother died. Probably the first confrontation. But it didn't compare to when my dad died when I was 13. Oh, we did some mighty wrestling in those days. And then there was the whole matter of vocation, the call to the ministry. That was a prolonged wrestling match. It went on for years. God persisted, however. And then about 15 years ago, we had another bout. God came to me one day and said, I want you to do the work of an evangelist. Now, mind you, evangelism had never been a high priority on my radar. In fact, I'd done my best to avoid ever doing evangelism. And yet, as I stood there in that moment and in the weeks and years to come, I realized that God had been preparing me in small and large ways every step of my ministry to get to that point. He'd equip me with the tools, even though I didn't see it. Even after the initial call to be an assistant to the bishop, to do the work of evangelism, I thought that maybe I could reshape the position so that I could avoid doing that work. And then God threw the haymaker. My position morphed into a position with the National Church called Director of Evangelical Mission. It was now in my title. It was now my responsibility. I was no more thrilled than I was before. And yet now, 15 years later, I'm the last one of those original DEMs still in the field. I've written a book on evangelism that's being used across the country. And I've been on the evangelism training team or task force for the ELCA for the last few years. How did that happen? One of my favorite Bible stories, and those of you who know me are not surprised, is Jacob wrestling with God at the river Jabbok. If you know anything about the story of Jacob, you know that he's a dirty, rotten scoundrel. He's a manipulator, a conniver. One might even call him a Machiavellian. And yes, there are some decided similarities between me and my namesake. Every time Jacob gets in a scrape, he manages to come out smelling sweet. Even when it looks like he's been duped, he gets the upper hand. But now we find him anxious. In the morning, he is to meet his brother, his twin, his estranged brother. Jacob has sold Esau down the river more than once, conned him. How the reunion will go is up in the air. Jacob has a plan to keep the advantage, and he's already started it in motion. But for now, he is alone in the night. And somewhere in the night, he is joined by a stranger who wrestles with him. And unlike all the other wrestlings, Jacob doesn't gain an advantage. It's a draw. And they wrestle until daybreak. Finally, Jacob decides to seek that advantage. Tell me your name and give me a blessing. Well, the stranger, whom we recognize as God, does not reveal the name of God, for that would give Jacob the upper hand. It would give him power. Instead, God gives Jacob a new name. No longer Jacob, but Israel. And rather than a blessing, God gives him a limp and transforms Jacob into a blessing for those who will follow him. For he will be a critical chapter in the story of God's dealing with his people. When we wrestle with God, we are transformed. It has been that way since the beginning. God wrestled us from the powers of sin and death and the wiles of the devil in the waters of our baptism, plucking us out and giving us new life. He is with us as we wrestle with our daily lives, with all the cares and the concerns and the frustrations and the problems. He wrestles us week after week into community as we gather as the church. As we come before him to eat and to drink in Holy Communion, he continues to wrestle with us as we confront the life, death, and resurrection of Christ and what that means for us. And he wrestles us back out the door into the world from which we have come to be a blessing. And as we limp our way through life, God continues to go with us, transforming our daily lives into holy encounters with God and with our neighbors. That through us, others in the midst of their wrestling may encounter the one that transforms life into a blessing. Who knew that we were all called to do the work of evangelism? I guess that's why we are limping along these days. Amen.